Okay, I think we're live. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me on what's a really exciting webinar for me. Back to School, Ubuntu in Education, talking about how Ubuntu delivers a sustainable, secure, and cost-effective solution for learning institutions. I'm Oliver Smith. I'm the product manager for Ubuntu. And today I have a special guest, Aaron Prisk, who's our community engineer at Canonical. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me.
Yes, thank you for having me.
And the great thing about having Aaron here is before joining Canonical, he was actually a technical director at a number of US K through 12 institutions. So he's going to share today some of his personal experiences in bringing Ubuntu into the education system. So I'm really excited for him to be able to talk about that. So let's dive straight in. So today's timetable, I think for anyone here who's just exploring Ubuntu for the first time, maybe only just considering it, I'm going to run through a quick introduction to what Ubuntu actually is. Then I'll hand over to Aaron and he will talk about his perspective as an IT director. He's got a lot of interesting stories there to share. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about how Ubuntu extends beyond the classroom, right? By equipping students with those crucial sort of administrative and developer STEM areas of focus and learning, then you're essentially equipping them for a really rich and exciting future in academia, in research, and beyond. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end for a little bit of a Q&A session. So let's jump in straight away with an introduction to Ubuntu. So what is Ubuntu? Ubuntu is an open source Linux operating system that has been published and supported by Canonical for nearly 20 years. It'll actually be our 20th anniversary next year in 2024. And as you can see from the screenshots there, it's evolved a lot, but we've always really focused on the concept of usability and accessibility in a way that sometimes sort of Linux operating systems have often been have a reputation for being complicated or difficult to learn. We've always prided ourselves in providing something that is familiar for new users to get hold of, but also still enables those experts and developers to really get the most out of both their hardware and their software. So it's a really versatile operating system. It's used for everything from personal computers, from laptops, data science workstations, to servers, to data centers, to the cloud environments, and also in the Internet of Things. It's community driven because it's open source. It's supported by a large active community of developers have millions of users from all over the world, and that creates a really fantastic community of learning resources, troubleshooting guides, documentation, and also contributions to the main operating system itself. And finally, it's the enterprise choice. Ubuntu is increasingly used in large scale organizations. It's the number one operating system across public clouds from Amazon to Azure. And it's the most popular Linux desktop for enterprise developers. It's also a really cost-effective solution, and I think when we start to think about the education space, budget is always a sort of really big concern. And so Ubuntu is widely supported on a range of devices from Dell, HP, Lenovo, even the Raspberry Pi. And so you can be sure that Ubuntu is well tested across a range of devices from all of the major manufacturers that you're familiar with. And that spans right the way down to older devices. We've been doing this a while, and you'll often see that operating systems that are as lightweight as Linux and Ubuntu will actually perform much better than, say, Windows on older devices. And that means you get a lot more bang for your buck out of those older machines, and you can really extend the life cycle of those devices. Because it's open source, there are no licensing fees for Ubuntu, and every long-term supported release of Ubuntu that we bring out every 2 years is supported for everybody for 5 years with security patching and maintenance. Privacy and security are really core values for Ubuntu as well. So With security, we provide regular security updates. There are encryption options available right out of the box, and we have various tools and technology that ensure that applications are strictly confined. They only have permissions to access the resources and data that they need to run. And as an operating system, we have a privacy by design approach, in the sense that we don't track users' data. We only collect the information that we need to provide things like software updates and security patching, things like that. And because this whole operating system is backed by Canonical, that means we can provide enterprise grade support. So that 5 years of security patching for long-term supported releases is expanded to 10 years with the Ubuntu Pro subscription. And that covers not just the Ubuntu operating system, but also all of the software and applications that are available in Ubuntu Universe, which is essentially the library of applications that are available within the Ubuntu ecosystem. So we commit to supporting those from a security patching perspective for 10 years. And then alongside that, there are various other tools such as Landscape, which provides sort of fleet and device management, as well as various compliance and reporting configurations for Ubuntu to adhere to sort of special case or highly regulated environments. And then there's also access to our knowledge base and 24/7 support from our canonical support teams as well. So you're really in safe hands with Ubuntu. So let's dive in a bit more into education, because I think Ubuntu has a really compelling offering in this space, and I know that Ubuntu is used by around 200 educational institutions at the moment that we're aware of, and a lot of that comes down to these key points. So the first one is the rich application ecosystem. So a lot of the apps that you might be familiar with on, say, Windows or on Chrome are available on Ubuntu. There's obviously a huge range of developer tools, which you would expect, such as VS Code and IntelliJ. But you've also got those productivity apps that everyone relies on these days, particularly in the era of sort of remote working or remote lessons. So you've got things like Teams, you've got things like Zoom. You also have a lot of the creativity tools that people might expect in these environments. Tools like Blender, that we have support for Unity, and the Unreal game engine, for example. So you've really got a huge spectrum of applications that are essential for these kinds of environments. I spoke before about how we were certified on the Raspberry Pi, and we really are very proud of the fact that we treat the Raspberry Pi as a first-class citizen. It's one of the biggest selling PC devices ever made, and it's just such a fantastic, affordable way to bring sort of science, technology, learning to classrooms, because it's small, it's affordable, it encourages that tinkering and experimentation. And with Ubuntu, we're really excited to support and enable that community. I talked about our enterprise grade support with Ubuntu Pro, but because of our huge range of community, our huge global community, you also have access to a vast array of free resources, right? There's places like Ask Ubuntu where you can ask troubleshooting questions, but also if you're learning Linux, or even if you're learning development in general, you will often find that the learning resources out there on places like Udemy will actually use Ubuntu as a base OS. So here in the screenshot, I've searched for Ubuntu explicitly, but that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of courses and ways of learning, say, how to do web development or data science, that basically start from an Ubuntu base for getting started. So there's loads of fantastic resources out there for people to get familiar with Ubuntu and to learn about all of the different things that they can take advantage of when they're on top of this platform. The other thing that we're really investing in, particularly recently, is in manageability. You know, often people who are thinking about adopting Ubuntu are doing it from a Windows ecosystem as a starting point, right? They may be wanting to adopt Ubuntu gradually. Say they want to bring it into their computer labs, for example. And that can often be sort of a point of concern for IT managers who may be familiar with the Windows ecosystem, about how do those skills that they have administering those devices transfer to something like Ubuntu. And so we've actually invested a lot of time in Ubuntu Desktop in making sure that Ubuntu plugs in nicely with tools like Active Directory, and we have things like full group policy object support there, so that IT managers who are used to managing Windows can use those same tools to manage Ubuntu as well, which really lowers the barrier to entry for them, so that they can feel confident that they're bringing Ubuntu into a space that is secure and sort of well managed as well. And I think sort of finally, the thing that's really interesting for me is learning, like getting familiar with and learning to use Ubuntu at an early age, whether you want to be a developer or not, is really helpful for building those long-term real world skills, because you have a much deeper sense of understanding of the operating system that you're working on. You have the ability to sort of tinker with and customize your machine, and it really helps you understand the sort of underlying technology that is the building blocks of our world going forward. And so for those who are interested in future careers in STEM or data science or AI and machine learning, robotics or engineering, then building these skills and building up that muscle memory early is going to prove invaluable when it comes to future opportunities in these sorts of areas. This is one of my favorite photos here, is actually of the Event Horizon Telescope team, who had in this part of the documentary, they just got a picture of the first ever real world image of a black hole, and it was so fantastic to see that they were using an Ubuntu desktop to open that up and process those images. So that's something that I found really inspiring. Anyway, that's enough from me. I think the most interesting thing now would be to talk to Aaron about his real world perspective, right? I've talked about these things in theory, but Aaron here can really talk about them in practice. So Aaron, thank you so much for being here again. And yeah, over to you to tell us more.
Thank you, Oliver. I appreciate it. So, as Oliver mentioned, prior to joining up with Canonical and the community team here, I worked as an IT director and a network admin and a sysadmin at two school districts in the state of Pennsylvania here in the United States. For some background, this is a very rural region of the country. These areas have historically high poverty rates, which really leads into some of the context that I'll get into with our initiative. These schools had about 1,000 students and right around 150 full-time staff members. Next. So there's a lot of challenges that anyone going into public education will face, especially from the education technology side, and that is how to ensure technology access, fluctuating budgets, understaffing of IT departments. There's a lot of complex laws and regulations for public entities. You have a burden of old or legacy devices. There's a lot to do with student privacy concerns. It's becoming an increasing concern of parents and guardians, is if their students' data is being safely protected. And also, with any school district, there's always changing administration, and that comes with changing visions and ideals that encapsulate what the school wants to reach for. So at West Branch, we had a dilemma, which was we had about 1,200 devices ranging from 2 to 8 years old in some cases. This was a very diverse fleet. We had all the way from Raspberry Pis, very small niche devices, all the way up to these high-end workstations. But we had a constant stream of problems, hardware and software. And the just buy new devices was not really an option for us. As I mentioned, this is a rural, lower income region. So just simply forklifting our existing infrastructure and dropping something new just was not practical. So what we had to do was form a committee. We needed to find a path forward. So we formed our technology committee, which was comprised of IT staff, administrators. You have superintendent, principals, our special education director. We had some technology coaches take place in the conversations, teachers, and we actually invited some students to come and weigh in on their unique perspective. we knew that we had to do something because this technology was becoming more of a burden than a blessing. What we determined early on was this was a platform issue, not necessarily a hardware issue. We had a very large Windows ecosystem, and we knew that that seemed to be the bottleneck in our education offerings. So we wanted to evaluate what all of our platform options were. So we looked into Windows, newer versions of Windows, Mac OS, Chrome OS, and Ubuntu. And the core factors we looked into really were cost, and that's total cost. So the cost of licensing, any support contracts, training of IT staff and teachers, compatibility, mostly around hardware. Is this operating system going to be functional on the broad array of devices that we have? Application ecosystem. So this is academic software, math, science, history, LMS, which is learning management system. Can our students take tests on these devices? Can our teachers input grades and do assessments on these devices? And then also, ultimately, we have state testing software. So this is state mandatory software that had to work, and it was contingent upon us getting funding. So very critical. Manageability. So your fleet management, patch deployment, remote support. We needed to know that we could control and support these devices on campus and also when their devices are at home. Security and privacy. So federal compliance. There's a lot of different rules and regulations on a state and federal basis. SIPA and FERPA are two very well known. And also a malware vulnerability. Are these devices going to be secure? They're going to be housing sensitive student data. Are they going to be targets for malware? And then ultimately is performance. So as I say, the backpack to browsing time, the time which the student can take the device out of their backpack, put it on the desk, and then actually use it as a functional learning tool. So in these meetings, we tried all these different operating systems on a host of devices, and we ultimately came to the conclusion that Ubuntu was the platform that we wanted to go with. It offered the best compatibility with the new hardware that we recently purchased and our existing legacy hardware. It offered the best blend of native and more web-centric applications. It respected the privacy of our students and staff out of the box. And there was a high degree of platform customization and flexibility, which was really, really critical for us. So, and what was nice to see was this was a unanimous decision. So this was the IT staff, the administrators, the teachers and students. Everyone unanimously said, yes, this is the platform that we can build around. So basically, we took that mandate from the technology committee and decided to institute it during the summer months. So for school districts here where I'm from, you have about 2.5 months of summer break time, which really is crunch time for IT staff. And we wanted to migrate everything. So this is new devices, old devices, anywhere we could. We wanted to make the jump to Ubuntu. And in doing so, we built 2 custom images. We wanted a full-fledged, I would say more stock Ubuntu image for our newer and more capable devices, and a lightweight image for some of our legacy or more computer lab-centric devices. We used a host of open source tools to manage all the inventory and deployment. We used KVM, Jenkins, a tool called Fog to handle all of the actual deployment. At one point, we were able to go from a clean device to an Ubuntu login screen in less than a minute, which we thought was a pretty incredible milestone. And what was nice, too, is we had a fairly small IT staff, so we were able to pull in interested student technicians where they could learn about Linux, they could learn about education technology, and also giving us that extra pair of hands that we desperately needed. So we deployed everything in the start of the next school year. And after about 6 months, we wanted to meet with the technology committee again to do a full assessment to determine if our initiative was truly successful. And I break this down into the Ubuntu impact into multiple categories, which is firstly the device impact. How did changing or moving to Ubuntu affect the actual raw performance of the devices? And it was dramatic. We saw far better performance for these legacy and newer devices, improved battery life, much faster load times. I would say double the load times of what we experienced from the previous year, which leads to the second impact, which is the academic impact, arguably the most important impact. There was less time waiting on the device and more time learning. And as an educator, that's ultimately what you care about. You don't necessarily care about what the platform of the operating system is. You need it to be a functional tool for instruction, which then leads to the IT impact. We saw a dramatic drop in our support help requests. Our SLA time was improved dramatically. And I think overall it improved our department processes. When a device was malfunctioning, we were able to take it, assess it, possibly reimage it in a tenth of the time that we did from the previous year. The financial impact, we saw a huge reduction in software licensing and hardware replacement costs. We were initially planning on a $500,000 hardware replacement, which we didn't have to do. That money could be cycled back into our general funds and used for other avenues that we thought were more critical. And then ultimately, the community impact. As I mentioned in the first slide, this was a historically underprivileged area. And we felt that we were being passed by other schools in our region. We were being left behind. Moving to Ubuntu, I believe, helped not just catch up with these schools, but actually leapfrog them and give this historically impoverished area access to really good, high quality education, software, and just a generally more impactful education experience. Now, that's not to say there weren't any obstacles that came along with making the jump. Anytime you make a change of platform at this scale, there's going to be some hurdles that you have to overcome. And the first hurdle that a lot of people probably associate with making the jump of platform is the software challenges. Is my software that I need going to work on this new platform? So we had to look at our education software offerings and determine, is this critical? Do we really need this? Can we possibly live without it? Are there alternatives? In many cases, we did find that there either was compatibility, or they were very good and I say equal replacements out there. Most of them being open source. The second hurdle, which was hardware partners, we wanted to find hardware partners that would fully support Ubuntu. Ideally, those who maybe be willing to possibly ship Ubuntu or an OS agnostic device that we could quickly put Ubuntu on. Thankfully, we were able to find some really good partners with Lenovo at the time. And so with that change in platform, change of device, you have to look into like the curriculum adaptation and how they handle this new operating system and device. So that's working with teachers, training, classroom integration, basically training the trainers. We had to train our tech coaches to go into the classrooms and show them how best to utilize these new devices. And then ultimately, the fleet management solution. So with a small number of IT workers in our team, we ended up opting to build some of our own in-house tools for fleet management. And we wanted to build some tools that I could give to let's say a computer lab teacher who wanted to deploy, let's say, Blender to his classroom for a project. I wanted it so he could easily do so without having to go back to us. So that took a fair amount of time, but it was ultimately a very, I think, rewarding experience. Next slide. I think, as Oliver mentioned, one of the most exciting aspects of open source and education is seeing how students use it to innovate. And we took a very purposeful and philosophical approach to deploying Ubuntu at West Branch. And we wanted to actively encourage them to experiment and tinker. There's a tendency for I think schools and IT administrators to want to lock everything down as much as possible. More control, the better. We didn't want to take that approach. We saw the device as, rather than just a single tool, as a hammer, for example, we saw Ubuntu as an entire toolbox that we were giving these kids. You wouldn't use a hammer for every application. You wouldn't use a screwdriver for every application. So we tried to express that to the students when we gave it to them, that this is a device that they can customize, really make their own, and kind of have a say in how their education would take place. Some examples of my favorite student innovations that we saw. I had a middle school student who used it's called Makey Makey tools. They connected these this little small board to bananas, and they were able to use it to control Super Mario World, which was amazing. And these were sixth graders that came into our office, excitedly set this computer down with these bananas and said, "Watch this." When I went and approached their teacher, I said, "This is amazing. How did you teach them this?" They said, "No, I didn't do anything. This was all the students." So these were 12-year-olds who took it upon themselves to learn how it all worked, and it was an amazing experience. We also had students that would install the lamp stack, and they used it to build their mathematics project for their senior year. Students who taught themselves how to use Python, this happened a number of times. They would build tools and games and little scripts, and they were always so excited to come in and show us what they built. We had a student who learned how to use a bunch of security tools, and they actually credit their usage of Ubuntu in high school to their current career that they have in security analytics. So as a whole, it was a very, very successful initiative. And I think some of the key takeaways that I really want to drive home also is we were able to not only deploy what I think is a very high quality uh, educational suite to these kids. We were able to save a lot of money for a district that desperately needed it. That savings we're able to cycle back into our general funds to use for buying new devices for making meaningful improvements in other areas of the school. So it really truly was a win-win for the school. We were able to take some of those principles to future schools and show them how they could implement them. We were able to use an all open source stack to build video streaming programs, which ended up spreading to about 3 or 4 other schools in our region. And then from that, I think the open source model of sharing and cooperation, we saw a litany of other IT directors and students and teachers from all over the world reach out to us and say, "Hey, how can we do this too? This is amazing. How can we learn from this? What can you teach us?" So it was a very rewarding and enriching time, and I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's always fantastic, particularly to have you on the community team with this kind of history and these kind of experiences, to really see firsthand sort of how having open source accessible technology like Ubuntu can really inspire students to experiment and learn new skills. And the nice thing about this is that these skills are ones that can stay with you, that can grow and go all the way through your educational but also your professional career. I think one of the things that I personally find so fantastic about Ubuntu is that the device that you learn on as a student, it's the same operating system as the sort of engineers who are working in cutting edge research, say in government research or in the latest AI technologies or in new sort of robotics startups, right? Everybody has access to the same operating system. And so you can be sure that the skills that you're building today in the classroom are going to be valuable and extensible over the course of your life. There isn't that need to sort of switch over outside of the Ubuntu ecosystem to get to the next level. Um, and so, speaking about the next level, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what happens after the sort of high school experience, right? You're going into universities, and universities are going to have computer labs filled with Ubuntu. They may even have sort of back-end systems that are running on Ubuntu servers, and then the outcome of those sort of research departments in universities is then obviously going on into a professional career. And I wanted to highlight a case study that we put up on the website last month, from New Mexico State University, where we got the chance to talk to their physical science laboratory and understand why they had adopted Ubuntu and what they were using it for. So New Mexico State University, the physical science laboratory side of it has a really interesting past, right? It was founded in 1946 to support the sort of United States space and rocket programs. And so it really sits at the cutting edge of sort of real world high stakes research, right? They're looking at aerospace, looking at electronic warfare, cybersecurity and telemetry, even things like missile systems. And so they carry out research for academic, industry, and federal partners, including NASA and the Department of the Defense. So it's really critical for them that the students who are working with them are building skills that are compatible with these environments that are very highly regulated, where security is extremely paramount, and where sort of best practices are really important. And so it was fantastic to be able to hear about why they chose Ubuntu. So essentially, what came about for them was a new set of Department of Defense cybersecurity requirements that they needed to comply with, and that was essentially the FIPS compliance requirements. So, and they had quite a short year to achieve that compliance. And the current Linux operating system that they were using was CentOS, and CentOS actually was recently announced to be reaching end of life slightly earlier than expected as well. And so they had this sort of triple or sort of double whammy of impacts here. They had to achieve that compliance, but they had to find a new operating system as well that was both cost effective, transparent, and also something that they could easily upskill their students and researchers with as well. And so they evaluated a number of different Linux operating systems. This is primarily in the sort of server environment. So they were looking at Ubuntu. They were comparing against Oracle Linux, Rocky Linux, and Alma Linux. This is sort of interesting because they're in the same sort of Linux ecosystem as CentOS. And so that migration option is often sort of simpler. But really, the outcome of that evaluation was Ubuntu, largely because of its accessibility, which we've talked about before, but also the broad, the sort of unmatched knowledge base of the global community, right? Who are building resources and tutorials and troubleshooting guides that are absolutely critical for doing that initial setup. So you can see in the quote on the right, that the accessibility of information about Ubuntu and guides on how to get started was a really big factor in their decision. And then obviously Ubuntu, we put a lot of effort into ensuring that we deliver, FIPS compliance on our long-term supported releases. And so that was something they knew they could achieve out of the box. And so this is sort of how the process went, right? They started from CentOS, they evaluated Ubuntu and Oracle, and really they ended up going with Ubuntu because of the ability to have the resources they needed to set up. And that allowed them to achieve FIPS compliance relatively quickly, thanks to our Ubuntu Pro subscription. And then that allowed them to do two things. First, they could deploy Ubuntu across the researchers who are dealing with sort of Air Force, Army, and Navy areas, but also the internal IT management of the physical science laboratory is actually run by the students themselves, right? It's part of the educational process. And so they also onboarded those students to Ubuntu as well. So a really interesting story that sort of spans quite a few different parts of the stack here. So as a result, they ended up finding something that was very cost effective because they were able to get sort of very affordable support for that compliance via Ubuntu Pro, and then obviously Ubuntu as a base operating system is sort of free from licensing restrictions. And then they basically found that what was nice about Ubuntu was its flexibility and its agility. So it meant that they found it very easy to sort of rapidly spin up test environments or development environments to start experimenting with new ideas. They were able to achieve that compliance, and the nice thing was the sort of student feedback, right? They felt glad to be able to draw on the knowledge of the community, become part of that community themselves, and learn really critical Linux sysadmin skills that were going to prepare them for sort of future employment at these sort of advanced research companies. And so yeah, so we're wrapping up here. As I mentioned, I think one of the great things about Ubuntu is that you can download it and get started right away. And as you heard from Aaron, there's a lot of things that you can do thanks to its open source nature to sort of spin up your own infrastructure and ways to customize and support those images. But obviously, one of the advantages of talking to Canonical is that we can provide additional layers of support on top of that. So essentially what we offer here is Ubuntu Pro, which is a sort of comprehensive subscription that basically covers all of these different value adds that layer on top of the base operating system. So the main advantage, I think, really is this 10 years of security patches. So every Ubuntu long-term support release benefits from security patching for 10 years. So that means, we're still supporting things like Ubuntu 18.04. And this covers not just the Ubuntu operating system, but also the huge ecosystem of applications and packages that are in the Ubuntu Universal Repository. So that's sort of critical data science tools like R, Python. You got access to web frameworks like Node.js, Nginx, and then you've got applications like WordPress that are also covered by this security commitment. So basically, your whole open source ecosystem is covered by that. You also get access to Landscape, which is essentially our Ubuntu fleet management tool, and that will manage Ubuntu desktops and Ubuntu servers. It allows you to do monitoring, compliance, permission control, configuration management to really make sure that your users have the permissions and applications that they need to be productive. With Ubuntu Pro, we also give you these advanced group policy object support tools for Active Directory, which allows you very fine-grained controls over the configuration and customization of your Ubuntu images as well, and means that people who are more used to administering devices from something like Active Directory are able to use those same workflows to basically stay within that ecosystem that they feel comfortable with and knowledgeable about. I've talked a few times about the areas we do to support security and compliance for sort of sensitive or federally regulated workloads, and then there's also access to our professional support team on either weekday or 24/7 basis to augment the community resources that are already out there. And I think one of the nice things to call out here is that we also have a discount program. We really value the education space when it comes to Ubuntu and helping those learners become the scientists and researchers and developers of the future. So as part of that, we do offer a discount program for approved academic and research institutions who sort of fit certain criteria. So I just want to end on that note. But now I think there are also a few other links that you can go to. We'll put them in the chat as well, so you can reach out. But obviously, there's information about Ubuntu Desktop and Ubuntu Pro. But if you want to read more about the New Mexico State University Physical Science Laboratory, we've got a more detailed case study there. If you want to read more about Aaron's experiences, he's written a fantastic blog. And then we've sort of wrapped it all up in our blog about Linux for schools as well. So I do recommend taking a look at those if you want more information. As I said, we'll sort of link them in the chat as well. And that's it from us. So I think we've got some time to have a Q&A. So we're going to put on our cameras and yes, have a chat with everybody.
Oliver, can you check your mic for me? How's that? Perfect. There you go. Switching from headset to desktop mic so people don't see my gamer headset. Thank you for joining me, Aaron, for the Q&A. The questions have been coming in thick and fast, so let me try and answer them in a sensible order. We've had a couple of questions around policy and permissions management, and I think hopefully I addressed that in the sort of final section regarding our Active Directory support. So
one of the things that's really important for us is making sure that administrators who sort of come from a Windows background are able to reuse the skills that they've learned and invested when administrating sort of Windows estates and bring those to Ubuntu. So what we add is essentially with Ubuntu Pro, we've got the authentication using your Active Directory credentials native to your Ubuntu device, but we also now have full group policy object support there, so you can really manage permissions, files access, tailor things like the desktop wallpaper in a way that maps directly to the way you would manage some of those things on Windows. And I think we're continually adding new features and policies to this over time. For instance, we've also included network share support recently, things like printer access, network certificate enrollment. So there's a really useful white paper that we've written about that. That's a good getting started guide, and also there's quite a lot of documentation on the ADSys GitHub as well. So if you're looking at that kind of analogous policy management, then I think you're going to find some things there that make sense. Now, one of the other questions that we've had is that's mostly talking about sort of Active Directory that's set up on premise, and there's a lot of organizations that are moving to the cloud, right? They're moving to things like Azure AD. They're using tools like Intune, and this is something that we're actively exploring at the moment. Now, when you're dealing with sort of a cloud-centric service, it's not as simple for us to start adding the same level of integration that we can or that we have done when it comes to Active Directory. But what we've added so far in some of the interim releases this year is native Azure Active Directory user authentication. So you can use your Azure Active Directory credentials to log into your device. And actually from the other side, Microsoft have been investing some work in terms of Intune integration with Ubuntu. So one of the things that they have is essentially an Intune compliance manager. So it runs sort of custom compliance checks. There's a few ones supported out of the box in terms of things like password complexity, release version, things like that. But you can also write custom compliance scripts to sort of essentially sort of check the status of whatever your device is before those students have access to resources that they would go through something like Microsoft Edge to have corporate protected resources that they can access there. So this is something that we're actively investing in the moment, and we're trying to move forward. And I think sort of watch this space. We're going to try and see if we can extend that support going into our next LTS release as well. So it's not quite the same level of device management that you would get with our Active Directory integration, but certainly in terms of policy enforcement and user authentication, then there's some good stuff to get started with there. 2304 was the first release, so the one we released earlier this year that had access to that, and we're working on making that available to people on Ubuntu 2204, which was the last LTS, and it will be available out of the box on Ubuntu 2404. There was a couple of other questions about the Ubuntu and migration from RHEL, CentOS, sort of Oracle Linux type distributions that we talked about, the New Mexico State University case study covered. It's one of those things where it's hard to deliver a one-size-fits-all answer to that, because I think the way people set up their infrastructure is so different. I think having talked to a number of organizations that have made that kind of switch, largely what you're looking at here is migration of deployment or administration scripts, and really there it's about trying to see whether the package names are the same, whether the file layouts are the same. Sometimes those things don't need as significant a modification as you might think. And then the other thing is a lot of the significant services or applications that you're running will often be running in a container. And so what's nice about that is you can migrate the containers at your own pace. So if you think about moving to something like an Ubuntu server, you can keep the applications or services that are running inside, say, CentOS containers, and keep those more complex ones running on CentOS while on a supported sort of Ubuntu base that's stable, that's certified, that we continually test, that has that long-term support. And because you're not got to worry about the license fees, right? It's not something that you have to lift and shift overnight. It's something that you can really take at your own pace and build that in and introduce Ubuntu over the course of that transition, and do that in a way where you make sure that each element feels comfortable and secure before moving on to the next world. Just to save me a bit of talking, Aaron, I thought there was one question that was quite interesting. There's a couple of people on Mac who were asking about how they could get involved in Ubuntu and what they could use to do some get involved with the Ubuntu community on that front.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a lot of ways to contribute to Ubuntu. First thing I would do is I would direct everyone to ubuntu.com/community, where we have all these contribution avenues. But in terms of places to contribute, we have art, we have design. We always need help for writers, technical support. You can lend your knowledge. A nice thing is a lot of software that runs on Ubuntu also runs on Mac OS. They're kind of like distant cousins in a way. So there's a good chance if you're testing out a tool on Ubuntu, you may find that it also works on Mac OS. So for testing and software development itself, you may be in good shape there. Also, it never hurts to actually try Ubuntu. If you don't want to fully install it on your hardware just yet, you could use a hypervisor, install it, or we have a tool called Multipath that's pretty amazing. I definitely recommend that. It's a great way to spin up a quick test environment, kind of poke around, kick the tires with Ubuntu a little bit, see if it's something that you like. But no, that's a great question. So yeah, again, it's ubuntu.com/community. You should find some great contribution resources there.
Cool. Another one for you that I thought was interesting, right? With the physical science laboratory, there were competing Linux distros, and there were people sort of expressing the different stakeholders having different needs. I think one of the questions was around whether you received sort of pushback in the Ubuntu adoption, whether there were competing distributions in there that you were balancing. Can you talk a little bit about some more of the obstacles on that front?
Yeah. Most users, especially in the school district, are probably most familiar with Microsoft Windows or even Google Chrome OS. So when you suggest something that's outside of that dichotomy, people look at you a little bit confused because they may not know what it is. So part of the initial pushback we got, I think, was just from the unknown of what this platform was. And that came with just educating them about the operating system, letting them actually try it and test it, showcasing what all it can do. We also got a little bit of pushback from some of our teachers initially, which was, is this a technology that we're going to teach the students on top of our normal curriculum? A teacher is teaching science, does not want to have to teach biology and how to use Ubuntu. They just want to have a device out, teach their subject matter. That's why we included students in our stakeholder meetings. So they had a chance to actually test out the platform and show, no, this is something that we're capable of doing. I think people take for granted sometimes that students and kids are very elastic and they can adapt very, very quickly. And I think Ubuntu does a good job of using those familiar desktop paradigms that is intuitive for a new user or someone that's maybe used Windows or Chrome OS or even iOS their entire life. So I think once we were able to show that to the teachers, that concern was quickly alleviated.
Cool. There was another question around Microsoft. There were some folks who were sort of reliant on the Microsoft ecosystem. I think one of the really interesting things that Microsoft have done and that we've partnered very closely with Microsoft on is support for Windows subsystem for Linux. So that's essentially a way to run Linux close to natively within a Windows device, and essentially it's a sort of deeply integrated virtual machine that connects to things like your Windows VS Code, your Windows browser, and inside that you can run Ubuntu and other Linux distributions. And we've spent a lot of time making sure that we have a dedicated team, making sure that Ubuntu experience on WSL is excellent. We look at performance optimization there. Last year we had the release of System D support in WSL, so that really unlocked a lot of the sort of service application development tools that are really critical for people working on administrative sides, on things like web development, that sort of stuff. Support for containers within the WSL environment. So I think if there is a situation where your organization has to be a Windows-only house, there are still lots of ways to make sure that the developers have access to a sort of full Ubuntu development environment, while still staying within the sort of walled garden of the Microsoft ecosystem. So it's been really interesting actually seeing the sort of influx of particular web developers, right, to the Ubuntu community who've been able to start using those sorts of tools to get involved from our side. I think we're running a little short on time now, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap it up there. If there are any sort of follow-up questions, keep them in the chat. Well, I'll take a look through and see if there's anything we can add as comments. But I've really appreciated everybody's engagement. Again, thank you to Aaron for sharing his experiences. I think those things are really invaluable, and I hope everyone here has a fantastic rest of the day. So, thank you very much for me.
Yes, thank you all for the excellent questions and for tuning in today.